Miracles and magical performances. The Bible is boiling over with such tales. In Exodus, we read about magicians turning sticks into snakes in a battle of wizardry with Moses. Yes, we are talking about magical staffs. Moses carried one around with him and was commanded to use it by God, tapping on stones and pointing it at things. Jonah living 3 days in the stomach of a fish, a talking donkey, or a man, Samson, possessing Superman powers within the locks of his hair. These should easily be identified as fable. However, many people today believe these stories actually happened. In the New Testament, we find a story about a magic pool. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in, was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. As if it contains one single magic spell, activated by whoever touches the water first. The New Testament describes Jesus much like a modern-day superhero who can turn water into wine, walk on water, and raise his hands to calm a storm. Twice, Jesus feeds starving crowds of 5,000 people with only 2 fish. At the very moment of Jesus' death, there immediately occurs a massive earthquake, and the entire noonday sky turns to night. As if this is not dramatic enough, the author of Matthew writes that after Jesus resurrected from a tomb, dead people began rising out of their graves and were walking around in the city. If we were to remove all of the miracles from out of the New Testament, there would be nothing left to believe in. Folks, the entire Christian story, from beginning to end, is held together by supernatural events and magical performances. Oddly enough, the only evidence to be found for all of these fantastic miracles and magical tales are within the bindings of the Bible itself. Apparently, Jesus could raise the dead, but could not leave a historical footprint. Nowhere outside of the Bible can any contemporary witnesses or historical evidence be found for any of these miraculous stories. This is very unsettling, considering that all of the events described in the New Testament took place at a time in human history when writing, philosophy, science, art, music, and historical record-keeping flourished under a great Roman Empire. During the time of Jesus, Rome had risen to a massive power with laws, civil codes, learning institutions, much like today's universities, and held an abundance of artists, historians, educators, and writers who compiled great libraries of literature. Rome was also very open and friendly towards a variety of religious practices, and would have taken extreme interest in the magical events surrounding Jesus and his apostles being performed throughout Roman provinces. If there really was a man who gave sight to the blind and restored the crippled, then Rome, its scholars, governors, historians, and philosophers would all have been passionately compelled to follow, study, and document such supernatural abilities performed by such a famous man. Here is what Dr. Bart Ehrman, a professor of New Testament history, writes about Jesus. In the entire 1st century, Jesus is not mentioned by a single Greek or Roman historian, religion scholar, politician, philosopher, or poet. His name never occurs in a single inscription, and it is never found in a single piece of correspondence. 0 zip references. How can this be? In the book of Matthew we read, "The news about him spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, and he healed them." Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the great crowd, they made an opening in the roof. People could simply touch Jesus and the Apostle Paul's garments and be healed. The New Testament says Jesus was famous. Yet the historical silence is alarming. Should we not consider the likeliness that these magical stories are fable? How is it that kings and governors would not be amazed and beg to have Jesus in their cities, or even raise statues and monuments in honor of such magical abilities? How can such fame and marvels go unnoticed, only to crop up much later in religious texts? Ironically, the Bible paints a picture of Jesus' great fame spreading from Asia Minor to Egypt, but actual history reveals a much different story. The very first outside witness for New Testament credibility comes from a short and controversial passage by a Jewish historian named Josephus over a half a century late. This is an embarrassment for New Testament credibility. The book No Messiah presents 126 writers during Jesus' ministry with exhaustive references who should have but did not record anything about Jesus. Seneca the Younger, Justus of Tiberias. The list can go on and on for those who should have noticed Jesus' miracles and magical death as they had occurred. Philo of Alexandria spent the first century traversing the gospel landscape and chronicles Jesus' contemporaries, Bassus, Pilate, Tiberius, Sedans, Caligula, yet knew nothing of Jesus' great fame or fantastic miracle events. We must logically ask ourselves, when is the absence of evidence of absence? We are told in the book of Acts that after Jesus died, 12 apostles went out and performed the exact same miracles. Now we have 12 men running around performing magic and miracle healings, and nobody in Rome gets the news? This complete lack of contemporary witness for all of the New Testament's fantastic miracle claims is a solid testimony to the stories being nothing more than religious lore and fable. The fact is, these magical stories did produce a huge splash at a much later time in history. We would expect that they would have made an even greater splash on the people of that day. The evidence speaks otherwise. Not only do these magical stories exist outside of what we know of reality, but the historical case for these stories also remains outside of reality. One argument Christian apologists have commonly used in defense of the New Testament goes as such. Maybe Jesus was written about, but all of the records were purposely thrown away by Rome and those who wanted to erase Christianity from existence. This response is startling and amusing. The creator of the jellyfish, giraffe, bald eagle, and every amazing form of life on earth allowed for his words and stories, which are to save mankind, to be categorized in with the conspiracy department? Good move, God. Good move. Questioning an actual historical Jesus rarely confronts the religious believer, And when it does, being inquisitive is an action rarely taken. Most Christians will immediately reject all opposition to their beliefs, shut down logic, and fall comfortably back into cognitive dissonance. The indoctrination of faith is so powerful that the question of reliable evidence doesn't even matter to a believer. They will base a belief purely off of emotional experiences and familiarity. However, for the few and brave Christian apologists who do venture into these issues, I would ask that you take notice how every historical contemporary witness they summon for proof of the supernatural life of Jesus derive well over 100 years after the facts. These witnesses are far too late to lend credibility. Some have been so desperate that in an attempt to move the witness program closer to Jesus' time frames, they have fabricated fake witnesses, such as Marcus Velleius Paterculus, which spread all over the internet after being reported by a fake news page called World Daily News. Due to the fact that the New Testament Gospels were written long after the facts and are all copies of copies, whereas no originals exist, Christians do find desperate reason to fabricate witness testimonies. However, these questions of New Testament credibility are not only unique to our modern age, but go all the way back to the earliest Christian writings. In one of the New Testament letters, written before the Gospels, the writer admits to problems concerning magical stories by saying, "Neither give heed to fables, which minister questions." It would seem that some of the early Christians were concerned about these magical stories or fables being told or credible, even within the earliest Christian communities. This letter provides us with proof that Christians were indeed fabricating fables, and not everybody was comfortable with such outlandish stories. These kinds of magical tales that too often wow the commoners were oftentimes not so popular with the more intelligent minds and philosophers of that time. For example, Hypatia, a Greek mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, and head of the Neoplatonic school at Alexandria, wrote, "Fables should be taught as fables, myths as myth, and miracles as poetic fancies." Abu Ala al-Mari, a philosopher and poet, wrote, "The world holds two classes of men, intelligent men without religion and religious men without intelligence." Lucretius, a widely popular philosopher, wrote, "All religions are equally sublime to the ignorant, useful to the politician, and ridiculous to the philosopher." Seneca, a philosopher and statesman, living at the exact time the Gospels were being composed, wrote, "Religion is regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by the rulers as useful." History might suggest that the most educated people in those days never did believe the religious magic and fairy tales that were popular amongst the masses. Little has changed in the human condition. All of this is irrefutable evidence that these magical tales found in the New Testament simply did not happen. A Christian may read in the Muslim scriptures that Muhammad flew up to heaven on a winged horse, and they will dismiss it as a silly fable. But when a Christian reads in the New Testament that Mary conceived a virgin birth to a God-man who floated up into the clouds, they suddenly believe. It is tradition, emotion, and familiarity that they cling to, not logic. These stories are not only extremely illogical, but extremely silly. A famous neurologist, Sam Harris, said, "The problem with religion is that it allows people to believe in masses what only idiots or lunatics could believe in isolation." People do not normally believe in magical tales. People cannot walk on water. If we believe they have, it should be a belief based on really good evidence. Carl Sagan once said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Let's take a closer look at what the evidence looks like for Jesus' great fame and performances. During the reign of a Roman Empire, all those who could write embodied a vast amount of history and placed much value on renowned people, places, and events. Among the vast historical records, we find that many notable figures from antiquity have recognized birthdays, deaths, or both. Augustus was born on September the 23rd, 63 BC, and died August 19, 14 AD. Caesar died on March 15th, 44 BC. Marcus Brutus, a famous assassin, died on October the 23rd, 42 BC. Mark Antony was born on January the 14th, 83 BC, and died August 1st, 30 BC. This list could continue on and on. Considering the amazing miracles surrounding Jesus' birth, why is his birthday unknown by a margin of up to 4 years, 6 to 2 BC? With the New Testament's claim of Jesus' widespread fame, accompanied by supernatural performances throughout his ministry, and a magical execution, why do we have an approximate time of death between 29 and 34 AD? Christians will emphatically assert that Jesus was the most important historical person in the world. But if so, how can an unknown time of death with a 5-year margin be even remotely feasible? How could the passionate followers of Jesus forget the weekend in which the resurrection happened? This is beyond suspicious. It is ridiculous. For such a grand and central event for Christian people, no one actually bothered to remember Jesus' time of death? To commemorate that magical weekend? Folks, this is completely implausible. The evidence is screaming out in every category that these magical stories found written in books long after the facts were stories that had evolved over time through the process of lore and religious knitting. In Part 2, we will look even deeper into the credibility of New Testament stories and if they can be considered as reliable or trustworthy information. Stay strong and wise, my friends.
I don't believe in masquerades. I don't believe that you're okay. I don't believe that God will save. Only you can solve your problems. I don't care what they sold.